I am extremely excited to bring to you today Todd Langford, the creator and owner of Truth Concept Software, pretty extraordinary software that's been created that tells the whole truth around money. Most often, when people are looking at money financially or dollars financially or math financially, lots of pieces are missing. And what Truth Concepts is going about doing is bringing all the pieces in so you can see what's actually happening around your numbers. I am grateful for Todd, and I'm excited for everyone here to get to know Todd a little bit, because Todd is one of my mentors, and Todd was a mentor before he even knew that I existed. So when I was transitioning into this business and into money and finance and life insurance and taxes, I would sit as a teacher during my office hours and watch Truth Concepts videos to understand the mechanics behind math. And so this is an honor for me to bring someone that's helped me understand money, understand the math around money at an extremely deep level. But the most important thing for me that stands out about Todd is that numbers tell a story, but the most important thing is the individual. And Todd is an extraordinary individual, and he's going to bring a ton of value today. So I'm super excited for Todd to be here. Todd, I'm grateful for you. Thanks for choosing to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I love this industry. I've been in it for 35 plus years. And I love seeing people come in like yourself that really wants to know the truth about the way the numbers work, about the way the math is. There's just so much hype in the financial industry as a whole in different areas. And a lot of people have no idea that are selling stuff, have no idea how the math really works. They caught an idea and they're just running in that direction, whether it's true or not. And you're one of those people that really seeks the truth to find out, how does this really work? What are the real implications for my clients, right, out there long term?
Right. One of the things I love that you've said in the past is every decision we make financially, and obviously just in life in general, there's going to be a ripple effect to that decision. And too often people are buying things or doing things off of that one decision, but they're ignoring the entire ripples for the rest of their life. And the thing I love about Truth Concepts is it helps people see those ripples and see the impact of that choice. Even though that choice looked good at the beginning, the ripples might not have been exactly what they thought they were going to be.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when we look out in the future, the one thing that we absolutely know is none of the numbers that we're looking at today are going to be what's going to happen 30 years from now. But we need to look out there 30 years, 40 years, 50 years to see if we're pointed in the right direction and know that we need to make adjustments along the way. And I think what happens in the financial industry so often is that look into the future about how all those decisions impact the big picture is left out. And we focus on one asset in a vacuum and don't realize the destruction it may do to other assets because of taxation or fees or whatever else. And so we really have to look at everything from a more holistic view and not lock ourselves in a place where we can't wiggle, because we know we're going to have to do that as time goes on, right? So we have to have options open to us to be able to shift.
Yes. So the audience that we're speaking to is extremely sophisticated. They're smart. They have medical degrees. They have doctorate degrees. They're people that have really taken a ton of time to learn a lot about their field and their craft so they can be the best business owner and biggest, highest value to their community. But oftentimes when it comes to financial numbers and how do I assess whether something is good and the ripples are actually going to be a big benefit to me, what are some tips that you can provide around that for these people that are already smart? They're brilliant people, but they don't know how to assess whether a decision financially is actually going to be what it says down the road and all the ripples that go into it.
Sure. So there's several areas that you've opened up there. And I think one of the main ones is to be open-minded. One of the problems with financial math is it doesn't work the same as grade school math. And people try to do that to make sense of it. And the problem with grade school math is everything is about today. So those numbers are true. 3 plus 3 is going to be 6 today. But it may not be over 10 years, right? Because there's an element of time. And that's a tough piece for people to get their head around. And so it really a lot of times takes a financial advisor, because you've got to have a financial calculator to actually calculate time. And it has to do with opportunity cost, the time value of money, and all of those pieces that have those ripples that you've talked about along the way. And I think, unfortunately, when we look at the internet, I think it started more truthful, but that's where a lot of people get their information, right? Is looking on the internet. And whatever you go into looking for with that mindset, you're probably going to find an answer that you were looking for.
Right.
Not necessarily the right answer, but the one that you thought it was going to be, because you can find plenty of supporting information, whatever it is, whatever hole you go down. And so it's tough to take that as an absolute source, because, I bet half the articles totally contradict the other half in a particular subject. And so how do you know what's the truth? And I think a big part is, as you said, you've got very smart people that are listening to this, that are watching this, and they just need to apply that to that analysis, to the information they're getting from somebody else, to make sure it makes sense. And I think a lot of times people feel like, well, I don't know enough to question this advisor. And that's a mistake. They should be able to make it into an area where it's understandable. It should not be that complicated. I think a lot of times it's because the advisor really doesn't know the answer, and so they're not given that answer. And a big piece of it is there's risk in there that's hard to analyze, right? So the risk component is really a difficult piece, because you can't put a number around that. You can put a number around the other pieces, but when it comes to risk, I think you need to understand what the guarantees are. And that's a big, big piece. What are the absolute guarantees? What is the worst case scenario in this? What's the best case scenario in this? Not just what's the best case scenario, because life happens, right? It's not going to come out that way. And so, it brings up the idea of black swan events. People are always amazed when something happens, like, gosh, we didn't know 9/11 was going to happen. Gosh, we didn't know COVID was going to happen. But it happens over time, not that particular event, but some sort of major black swan event. So to think that over the next 30 years, everything is going to be perfect, you're going to fall well short of what you think you're going to end up with, if that is what it takes to come out on top. And so we need to understand that along the way, we have to mitigate that risk. We have to have some things in place that could get us through those bad times. I mean, you look at some of those big events, the real estate market crash as an example, and who got hurt in that? Not the people who had cash around to get them past and over that hump. The people that were pushed out to the limits, and they had no flexibility, they had no movement, and they had to sell at a terrible time to sell. And so there were a lot of people in those black swan events that actually made out really well because they were sitting on cash, as an example. So all that needs to be figured into that holistic picture. And we need to understand maybe some assets aren't as sexy as others. They're not really flashy and exciting, but they make the other assets, the more exciting assets, actually possible over time.
Is what I'm hearing you say, and this is a concept that you teach often, and many others in our sphere, is a lot of people are making their financial decisions based on the wealth outcome or the wealth potential of something, and they're neglecting the other path, which is just as impactful, which is the protection path, ensuring that you're actually going to get to the target goal. And too often people make financial decisions based only off of the wealth potential, with neglecting the risk and the protection that goes into it. So that when you have the black swan event that hits you individually, because the real estate crash affected those in the real estate for the most part that had a lot of real estate assets that didn't have the cash, that couldn't survive. But there's going to be some other crash that's going to hit you where you're at, that if you don't have the protection piece, it could be a global economic turmoil, or it could just be a personal economic turmoil, like a divorce or a death or something like that affects you only as an individual. All of those things need to be protected against, as well as you moving along the wealth accumulation path.
That's exactly right. And the reason I think that happens is because people associate protection as a cost. They associate that portion of their wealth creation as being contradictory to the wealth creation piece. So it's going backwards. And actually, if the right tools are in place, they can be on the same parallel path, right? We can have protection and wealth accumulation actually go in the same direction if we have the right strategy and the right tools in place. And that's what's often left out of most conversations. And it goes back to the idea of this asset versus this asset, instead of this asset inside of this total financial picture versus this asset inside of that total financial picture.
Right. I really like that. I think this conversation is at a good point to us to shift into a specific example of kind of some of the things we're talking about, how it looks good on paper, everyone else is doing it, but when you actually dive into the numbers, there's going to be some areas where it doesn't make as much sense. And so the common one that I use as the example is just a 401k. It's out there. Everyone, that's seen as the retirement vehicle. That's the way I'm going to create financial independence. That's the way I'm going to be able to retire. That's my source. And so everything goes into that. But when you dive into the numbers around 401ks and around the way they're functioning, it doesn't usually work out nearly as well as people in their minds are anticipating it to work out. So can you explain a little about what you've discovered as you've dove into the numbers around 401ks?
Sure. So, one of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation was the idea of everything's going to change out in the future, right? We know there's going to be shifts. And one of the big problems that I see around the 401k, it's not about the numbers directly. It's about the fact that you can't shift in that, right? You get penalized for taking money out of it. There are just a lot of pieces around that are a problem. Also, the federal government, because they gave you a tax deduction up front for putting money in there, they get to dictate what happens on the back end, and you don't get to have a say in that. Most other assets, when they make changes, they grandfather the existing tax law in there. But 401ks, they don't do that because, again, you got an advantage going in front, so they feel like they can just change it as they wish along the way. And they've done that many, many times. And so there's those pieces around that are a serious problem. And really that money's pretty locked up. Yeah, there's some ways you can get it in, hardships and other things without having to pay penalties, but it's not efficient. And so when we look at that and we think, okay, we've got money sitting in this 401k, it's all going to be taxed when it comes out. But even along the way, if some great opportunity comes along, again, like, we talked about real estate, somebody wants to shift into real estate, they can't use those dollars to go there and help with that real estate purchase. So it's really a pretty one-dimensional asset. And it comes down to, one of the things I talk about is letting the tax tail wag the dog. That's where people get caught up. It's like, oh, there's great tax advantages in having money in the qualified plan here. And they're focused on what happens today, but they're leaving out that holistic big picture and looking at what happens at the end. And somehow the American public has been fooled by this idea that you're going to be in a lower tax bracket when you retire. And so that's like, people are excited about the fact they're going to be in a lower tax bracket, and they really haven't looked at what it takes to do that. What it means is you're going to have less money than you have now. And that's not something to look forward to, right? I want to be in the highest tax bracket possible when I get out there. I don't want to pay any more tax than I have to. I mean, let's be real. But I want to have the kind of income that's going to put me in the maximum tax bracket. So looking out in the future, hoping to be in a lower tax bracket so that you could hide money today that you'd have to pay tax on and take it out later at a lower bracket, that's just not a good overall strategy.
Yeah, I often see with the people we're working with, people love the defined benefit plan. They're sold this. You're saving so much in taxes by getting because if you're in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you can get hundreds of thousands of dollars into a defined benefit plan or a profit sharing plan or a cash balance plan. And it's being sold as this tax break, but you're not realizing that when you put it in here, if you have a lot of assets and you stay in that same tax bracket, all you're doing is moving the tax bill to when you don't have your source of income anymore, and you don't want to pay as much. Like you're not making as much money. Then your business is gone. You're now pulling money out. It just doesn't make as much sense. So don't get stuck into saving taxes on defined benefit plans. To me, there's places for these. It's not an absolute thing. It's just you have to let the numbers dictate how much you're putting in and why you're putting it in and the motivation behind it. But right now in the marketplace, that's the absolute source of retirement. And in my mind, that's where people miss out, is that there's so many other asset classes and so many different things that people could and should be doing that they're missing out on those because they're caught in the absolutism of qualified plans.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, it's always a problem when you don't look at the big picture and the full piece of, okay, this is what it is going in. And I think part of it's terminology too. One of the things that you said was, and that's what we hear in the marketplace, is tax break. That's what they're looking at as a tax break. It's not. It's a tax deferral or a tax lien. That tax will come due. Somebody will pay it. And what's interesting is there are other assets that are deferred assets that the tax may not come due, but on qualified money, the tax will be paid either by the individual that puts it in there or by the heirs. At some point, that tax is going to be paid. There's just really no way you escape it. Like in real estate, you can get some tax breaks, and you can get a step up in basis at death to where it gets taxed without that, or you could do a death to where it gets taxed other pieces that's just not available to. They defer early in life, where a lot of times their taxable income is lower than it's going to be in the future. So they're really kind of doing reverse tax planning, right? They're deferring it in a lower bracket than when it's going to come out. And in the big picture, tax deferral, if everything was the same, is better than taxable.
Yeah.
Okay. But only if everything's the same. And when we get into the qualified arena, we can't guarantee that that's going to be the same, because in the future, we don't know what that's going to look like, what the federal government's going to feel like your what you owe is going to be, right?
Right. No, this is really insightful. Is there anything else that you're seeing as a pretty big misconception that people will just jump into and do because it's common perception amongst the marketplace of where people just do it because everyone else is doing it?
The market, everybody, it's funny when we look at the stock market as an example. Everybody wants to quote the S&P, but the general public doesn't do that. They end up buying high and selling low. And if you look at Dow Bar runs a 20-year average of what the investor actually does versus what the S&P is, and it's substantially less because of what their actual returns are. But everybody sees that big number. And I think something else that's kind of interesting is people a lot of times, like in the marketplace, it's just a give. You can make 8% without even thinking about it. I expect to do more than that, but 8% ought to be no problem. And yet, when we saw bonds just recently move, I saw an article where bonds had moved up to 5.2%. And the big concern from the securities advisors was, this is going to be a threat to my equities business because people are going to shift to bonds. Well, that's kind of interesting. If you think you can do 8+ in the marketplace, why would 5.2 gross in bonds be a deterrent? And I think it's because people inherently know that 8+ is a difficult number to actually hit, that there's a lot of risk around that seems a lot safer on the bond side, where if they could see bonds getting there, they'd be happier there with potentially less income, but knowing that they're at least going to get that. And I think that really spells out the idea of that protection going along the same path with our wealth creation.
Right. Yeah, this subject is really kind of grinds my gears a little bit when people show numbers around this, because they just show 8% forever, or they show 10% forever. And that, like, the difference between actual return and average return is not anywhere close. Yes, over a 50-year period, you're probably going to hit an 8% return, but how many people are in the market for 50 years without touching it and not doing any manipulation and adding more or taking out? And like you said, so like, I hate when people present that, because it tells a partial truth that takes a lot more digging to actually pull that out and what's actually happening.
It does. And the bigger issue is sequence or return risk in that scenario, right? Like you said, if you look out over 30, 40, 50 years, your average is probably decent, but is it going to be up or down? Where is that going to actually be when you need the money? And if the markets are down when you need it, it is devastating the account. Dr. Wade has done a bunch of research in that area and looking at what the impact of that is. And it's pretty shocking, because his numbers, with where the market is, to get, say, a 90% chance of having money last 40 years, your withdrawal rate from the equities better be, I think it's like 3.5%, somewhere around there is all you can pull off of there. Because when you pull it off in those down years, it really destroys the account.
Right.
During the accumulation phase, those sequence of returns aren't that critical. It's during the distribution phase that it's really tough. So,
right.
Just a lot of pieces around that. And having the right other assets in place can actually take away that sequence of return risk, right? And so we need to see what that big picture is.
Correct. I really like the math around Dr. Pfau, and it really is enlightening to see for people. I think it's good for people to know it because that's the truth of what's going to happen, and you got to know that that's how it's going to play out for you. So for those that are wanting to know more about that, I encourage people to look up Dr. Pfau and his work and see the math behind distribution phase of the retirement income. Let's shift into, because this is another piece I think people leave out, is the increase in health that people are experiencing. And a lot of the people we work with are extremely healthy. Like they're eating extremely well. They're way healthier than the average person in America. Having more good health now is going to probably lead to a lot longer life. And if you're choosing to end your business at age 60 or age 50 or age 65, you still have 30, 40, potentially 50 years of life that you have to live into. And I think that gets neglected sometimes when this comes to retirement planning, because everyone's trying to do what everyone else is doing. And 65 is this magical number that everyone spouts off at as the reality, when it probably is going to be a lot longer than 10 to 15 years before you pass away.
Yeah, and the thing about technology, which has driven a lot of that health-wise, right? It's exponential. It's not a linear growth. I mean, it's an exponential growth. So what we're going to see is potentially life expectancies really start to accelerate. And I've seen it just, we were talking earlier, 35 years ago, when I was in the business, a lot of illustrations on different things were run out, maybe at 85. And people said, well, they'll be dead before here, but just if you're odd and you live this long, this is what it looks like. Well, look at where we are now. That's a minimum most people should expect, not the absolute maximum. And so that's going to continue to go up. And I think what's difficult is for people to understand what kind of money it takes just to live the same lifestyle they have now with only a 3% inflation rate. If inflation really was only 3%, it's still, the compounding of that over time is going to be enormous. And so you look at where a lot of people are, and you talked about 65. Well, a lot of people got their real job. Maybe they've had it for 30 years, right? But they're going to be retired at least that long out into the future. If they live to be 95, that's going to be 30 years of retirement. How much money did they save to make that happen? And I think, that begs a question: is 65 really a realistic time to stop? And let's look at what those numbers look like out into the future. It's easy to look back and say, yeah, I can see that I'm making twice as much as I was, 10 years ago. Well, understand that track is going to continue. And so sometimes it's hard to look at that, but if we have the right tools and the right strategy in place, we should be able to make that happen. We just need some education.
I feel like it's just something that people just assume is going to happen. We're making too many assumptions based off of what we're sold, instead of like really looking at how long am I going to live and how much money do I actually have to have? Because it goes back to what you said with the 401ks, where people are wanting to lower their tax bracket because they're going to be in a lower tax bracket when they withdraw. That's you choosing to have a future that's less than now. Right. And like too often, that's what people are choosing with their financial decisions. They're choosing a future that's smaller than it is today. And that's not inspiring. You're not going to want to get up out of bed. You're not going to want to go live life and experience it when you're living a less life. We should be looking for bigger futures, not smaller futures.
Absolutely. But I don't think, because it's just become, part of the talk, I don't think people really realize exactly what you said, that they are choosing a lower lifestyle. We've had clients before that, because there's so much rhetoric around that idea of being a lower tax bracket, that they literally thought there were two sets of tax brackets. So tax brackets for the people that are working and tax brackets for the people that are retired. And because how in the world can anybody say you're going to be in a lower tax bracket? And so,
right. So oftentimes, and we'll just shift gears here a little bit. Oftentimes our clients they're successful, they make a lot of money. So they have a lot of different opportunities they're pitched their way. And one of the often things that's pitched their way is the life insurance piece. And they're told all this different stuff about whole life and IULs and VULs. And it's hard for them to know what's actually the truth. You've been in the industry for 35 plus years. What can you say from your experience as what is happening around these products so you can assess which one to actually choose and what's going to be the best choice for them, most likely for their situation? Obviously, everyone has different circumstances, but in most situations, it's probably not best for everyone to be doing XYZ product instead.
Yeah, I'm about the guarantees. And so if you look at what the guarantees are, because I plan on living a long time, right? If I know that life insurance is going to pay into my estate when I die, if that is an absolute, if that is a guarantee, then it changes my financial strategy during that distribution period when I pull the money out to live on, because I know it'll be replenished at my death. I know that other things can happen at my death and guarantee that that's going to happen. So it'll shift what I can do. If that is an unknown, if it's a maybe, if it's a thing where, well, as long as I die before the insurance lapses, well, I better not shift what I'm doing today because I can't guarantee all that happening out in the future. And that's the problem that I see with the universal life. And it's not the IUL, the index portion's the problem. It's just the chassis of the universal life. It's just got some risk around it that a lot of advisors that are selling the universal life product don't really bring forth. And if you look at them and you look at where the guarantees are and the things that can be shifted inside of that product, it's just not something that I'm comfortable for me. So how could I be comfortable with that for my clients? And most of the time what happens is they need to make sure they die by a particular date before that runs out. And that information is actually in the front of a lot of the illustrations, but nobody reads that because it's 20 pages of how they can shift the numbers and move them around. I want something that's solid, that's been around forever and continues to do what it's supposed to do. And that's where whole life comes in. And a lot of people get confused. They think they're the same thing, and they're drastically different. And again, it just comes down to, let's see what the guarantees are in both of these scenarios. What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And make decisions based on that versus hype about what's the new latest and greatest out there in the marketplace, right?
Right. I find that with IULs, it's very much sold as that the wealth accumulation piece. That's a part of the wealth journey there, and they're neglecting the protection piece. And unfortunately, I know that you and Kim have both been exposed to people that have bought ULs a long time ago, and just things have changed. They haven't kept up on it, and they fall apart. They just disappear from their use, and it's heartbreaking for people to see because people put a lot of money into those things, and they're expecting it to be there. But they don't have the protection piece. It's definitely more of the lack of guarantees aren't there. So you're riding a wave that may or may not be there in the future.
Yeah, and to me, the word insurance means to insure something happens. And I would much rather have my insurance be my guarantee. And if I want to play in the market or something like that, that's what the other money's for, and let that be the guarantee piece. But when we take our insurance, which is supposed to insure, and that's playing in the marketplace, that's really risking our guarantees. And so you have to wonder if it should still be called insurance at some point, right?
Right. I agree. So let's just finish with this. So whole life insurance, mutually bought whole life insurance. What can people use that as in their portfolio? Because there's a whole bunch of misconceptions. You're going to have people on the internet all over the place, like what you mentioned earlier, that will contradict this and that. But can you tell the truth around what whole life insurance actually is, the role it should play in someone's portfolio or their assets, and how it can be utilized for them so that it's seen beyond what they're hearing in the marketplace?
Sure. So, one of the things when we started this conversation was just about the idea of how that big picture is important. And in our lives, we need cash assets. That's what gets us through those black swan events and those other places, right? On the negative. On the positive, we also need cash to be able to take advantage of an opportunity that comes along. And life insurance cash value is not an investment, and people confuse that on the investment side. It's a savings vehicle. And if we look at the returns of a life insurance policy from the standpoint of a savings vehicle, an emergency opportunity asset, there's not anything out there right now that can compete with it from the standpoint of return over time. And it has the death benefit along with it. And for those that can qualify, a waiver of premium disability benefit with it. I mean, it's a phenomenal savings vehicle that, no bank rate, savings account, checking account can compete with it over time. And so when we understand that part and where its place is in the big picture of our financial strategy, we're not comparing that to the returns we could do in real estate or, potentially at the top end of the market. But if you're investing in real estate and you don't have cash, something's going to happen in the world that's going to make that a difficult thing at some point, which might cause you to lose everything if you don't have that cash asset. So do I want that cash asset sitting in my checking account at, 0%, 1%? I'd much rather have it in a place that's actually doing a lot more and has potential for long-term growth. And once we shift over from that accumulation side to the distribution, when we start living off of our other assets, the fact that we know that's going to come in and replace our assets in the end, it opens up all kinds of strategies that can help us get around the sequential risk returns that we're talking about with Dr. Fowle and all those other pieces. It just makes our strategy better for spending our other assets.
Yeah. Whole life insurance is the rock of it's the protection piece. It's the piece that we've been alluding to this entire time of the wealth accumulation. One of the protection pieces that really helps push everything further. You'll be able to take more distribution. You'll be able to be pushing and thinking bigger on the future you're going to have. When you actually stop working, you can continue to have an ever increasing amount of income to rise with inflation. So you're not reducing your lifestyle. It becomes the tool that enables that to happen. And it's really quite magical around how it works. I just wish more people would not just look at the surface of it and just move away from it so quickly.
Yeah, I think that's the big part, and that's what you said. You've got to be open-minded and make your advisor show you how it really works. What are the real numbers in every situation? And go down that path and see how it really fits instead of listening to the hype, most of it negative, around whole life insurance on the web. And it's kind of interesting. Dave Ramsey said, life insurance keeps people in mediocrity or something to that effect. But what's interesting about that idea is most wealthy people who have access to high-end financial advice and other pieces have a large amount of whole life insurance in their portfolio. And the reason is they're actually educated as to how it really works. And so that should be available for everybody, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because I hear people say, it's only the ultra wealthy that should have whole life insurance and everyone else should just go invest. And the math doesn't, when you look at the math, it doesn't matter the income level. It's just proportionate to the amount of money that they have. So it can be an anchor on anyone's situation, and it provides more protection. It'll allow them to more retirement income. It gives you liquidity access the entire time. And one thing I love that you say is when you have cash available, opportunities start showing up for you. And too often people don't even know that opportunities exist, but all of a sudden, once it's that the reticular activation system type of thing with whole life insurance, it opens that up, and all of a sudden you're like, holy crap, there's this business opportunity over here. There's this real estate opportunity over here. I can invest back into my business and merge with this one. There's so many things that just pop up when all of a sudden you have cash available that you didn't even know existed previously because you didn't have it available, so it never showed up in your life.
Yep. Because when it's in so many of those other assets, take the qualified plan, the 401k as an example, those things come up. You have cash, you think, but how are you going to get it to make this deal that you really had your eyes on, or maybe your heart on? Maybe it's something that really means something to you and it's finally become available, and you can't take advantage of it because you don't have actual cash later on, right?
Yeah. Well, Todd, I am really grateful that we had this conversation. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on today that you think would be valuable just for people as they go around financial products, math around finance, that you think that they should know that we haven't talked about today?
No, I think the biggest thing is ask your questions. If your advisor can't answer the question, then I'd find another advisor, right? I mean, it might be something that your advisor has to go investigate. You might bring up something that's a little unusual. Well, if they can go find the answer, that's great. But if the end answer is just trust me, it'll work out, that should not be enough. Okay. And be wary of the information that's on the internet. It will drive a lot of people to a life less than what they expected if you listen to all of that without actually looking at the numbers. So just be open-minded and get your questions answered, right? And I think the other thing is make sure you're talking apples to apples. This is a big thing in the financial industry that doesn't happen. Most of the time, it's gross returns on one asset against the net returns on another. What do I mean by that? Well, as an example, when we look at the market, you've got taxes, you've got commissions, you've got fees, you've got all these other pieces. What does that boil down to as a net rate of return? Because when we look at like life insurance as an example, the return we see in life insurance is net of all that. So we need to make comparisons on a level playing field where all the costs and all of the benefits are side by side.
Yes. Awesome. If people are interested, they're like, man, I really like what Todd had to say. He was really intriguing. I want to investigate his software. What's the best way for them to follow you, to learn more about the math behind things? If they're like really nerdy like I am and they just want to know the truth and they dive in and they're obsessed with videos and reading and figuring that out, how can they get in touch with you, or not maybe not get in touch with you, but follow you and get your information that you're putting out to the world?
Sure. You can go out to truthconcepts.com. There's a bunch of information out there. You can go look at the blog. There's a ton of math equations and pieces and parts that we put together that are out there that you can read for months and months on some of those pieces and parts. And you can also download the software for 30 days if you want to and play with it. So there's lots of resources. Go out there, look at it, and talk to your advisor.
Yeah. Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for the knowledge and value that you provided today, and we will see you in the future. Thanks.
Sounds great. Thanks, Justin.